When did following school rules become more important than saving your life? I was 3 bites into my turkey sandwich when my throat started tingling. Not the normal kind of tingle you get from spicy food, but that specific electric feeling I'd learned to recognize over 16 years of living with a severe peanut allergy. My hands went cold and I dropped the sandwich onto my lunch tray, while my best friend Autumn looked up from her phone with concern spreading across her face. "Something's wrong," I managed to say before my voice started sounding weird and thick like my tongue was swelling. She grabbed my water bottle and shoved it at me, but swallowing felt wrong, like there was something blocking my airway that shouldn't be there. I could feel my pulse hammering in my neck and my skin was getting hot and itchy all over, that familiar crawling sensation that meant my immune system was going haywire. The cafeteria noise seemed to get louder and more distant at the same time while I tried to remember the emergency protocol my allergist had drilled into me since I was 6 years old. My EpiPen was in my locker on the 3rd floor in the science wing, exactly where school policy required me to keep it, because medications weren't allowed in backpacks or pockets during school hours. The nurse's office had a backup, but that was on the opposite side of the building past the main entrance. Autumn was already standing up and pulling out her phone to call for help when the fire alarm exploded through the cafeteria speakers with that piercing electronic shriek that made everyone jump. The whole room erupted into chaos with chairs scraping and trays clattering as 300 students started moving toward the exits like they'd done in dozens of drills before. Mrs. Kovacs, the history teacher on lunch duty, was already at the cafeteria doors waving her arms and shouting for everyone to line up single file and move quickly to the parking lot assembly point. I tried to stand, but my legs felt shaky and wrong, and when I touched my face, my lips were already swelling. Autumn grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward Mrs. Kovacs while yelling that I was having an allergic reaction and needed my EpiPen from my locker. Mrs. Kovacs' face went tight when she saw us approaching instead of following the crowd outside, and she held up both hands like a traffic cop stopping cars at an intersection. "Everyone out now," she said in that sharp voice teachers use when they're not accepting arguments. "No exceptions. This is a fire emergency." Autumn tried to explain about the EpiPen and my allergy, but Mrs. Kovacs was already shaking her head before the words were fully out. "Fire protocol supersedes all other concerns," she said, and I watched her eyes flick to the security camera in the corner of the cafeteria like she was aware of being recorded. I could feel my throat closing more with each breath, this horrible tightening sensation like someone was slowly twisting a belt around my neck from the inside. "The locker is the other direction," I tried to say, but my voice came out as a wheeze that barely sounded human. Mrs. Kovacs stepped closer, and I could see genuine concern flicker across her face before she covered it with that professional teacher mask. "I understand you're scared," she said in a softer tone, "but fire drills don't stop for medical excuses because people die in fires when we don't follow protocol." She put her hand on my shoulder and started guiding me firmly toward the exit doors, where the last struggling students were disappearing into the bright afternoon sunlight. Autumn was arguing now, her voice getting higher and more desperate, saying that I was going into anaphylactic shock and would die without the EpiPen in the next few minutes. Mrs. Kovacs' jaw set in that stubborn way adults get when they've decided they know better than teenagers, and she said the paramedics could treat me outside where it was safe from fire danger, but right now we needed to evacuate immediately, because that's what the law required during a fire alarm. My vision was starting to tunnel at the edges, everything getting dimmer except for the bright rectangle of the exit door that Mrs. Kovacs was pushing me toward. I tried to dig my heels into the linoleum floor, but my legs weren't coordinating properly anymore, and I stumbled forward instead. Behind me, I heard Autumn yell something about getting the EpiPen herself, and when I managed to turn my head, I saw her sprinting in the opposite direction toward the science wing stairwell. Mrs. Kovacs shouted after her to stop immediately, but Autumn was already gone around the corner. We made it outside into the parking lot where students were gathering in their designated assembly areas by grade level, and the fresh air should have helped, but my breathing was getting worse instead of better. I sank down onto the asphalt and pressed my hands against my throat like I could physically hold my airway open through willpower alone. Mrs. Kovacs was on her radio calling for the school nurse while students started noticing something was wrong and forming a circle around us. I could hear their voices but couldn't process the actual words anymore, just a wash of concerned sounds that seemed to be coming from underwater. My lips felt huge and numb, and when I touched them with shaking fingers, they were swollen to probably twice their normal size. The itching sensation had spread to my scalp and down my arms, and I wanted to scratch at my skin until it came off, but my hands weren't cooperating with my brain's commands anymore. The world tilted sideways and I realized I was falling, my cheek hitting the warm asphalt while someone screamed. Through my narrowing vision, I could see Mrs. Kovacs' shoes and the bottom of her khaki pants, and beyond that, the crowd of students with their phones out recording everything because that's what teenagers do when something dramatic happens. Inside the building, Autumn was sprinting up the science wing stairs 3 at a time with her heart pounding and her breath coming in gasps. She'd been on the track team since freshman year, but she'd never run this fast in her life because she'd never been running to save someone's life before. The hallways were completely empty since everyone else had evacuated, and the silence was eerie after the chaos of the cafeteria. She reached the 3rd floor and turned left toward my locker, her shoes squeaking on the polished floor. She was fumbling with her phone to call me for my locker combination when she heard heavy footsteps behind her getting rapidly closer. Security Officer Whitmore rounded the corner at a run, his face red and his radio squawking with voices demanding status updates on the rogue student who'd violated evacuation protocol. Autumn tried to explain while still running toward my locker, but Whitmore was already shouting at her to stop and put her hands up. She ignored him and kept going, scanning the locker numbers until she found 3847, my locker. She spun the combination lock with shaking hands, messing up the sequence twice before getting it right on the 3rd try. The metal door swung open just as Whitmore reached her, and she saw my backpack hanging on the hook inside with the bright orange EpiPen case clipped to the front pocket exactly where I always kept it. She grabbed for it, but Whitmore's hand closed around her wrist in a grip that would leave bruises. She tried to twist away while explaining that I was dying in the parking lot from anaphylaxis, but he wasn't listening, just reciting school policy about evacuation procedures and how violating them during a fire emergency was grounds for suspension and possible criminal charges for endangering other students. Autumn did something then that surprised both of them, because she'd never been in a fight before in her entire life. She brought her knee up hard into Whitmore's stomach, and when his grip loosened in shock and pain, she yanked the EpiPen case free and ran. She could hear him cursing and his radio crackling behind her as she sprinted back toward the stairs, but she had a head start and the element of surprise. The stairs seemed endless going down, her legs burning and her lungs screaming, but she pushed harder because every second counted when someone was in anaphylactic shock. She burst through the ground floor exit doors into the parking lot where the entire school population was assembled, and she could see the crowd gathered around someone on the ground near the sophomore assembly area. She ran toward it, weaving between clusters of students who stepped aside when they saw her face. Out in the parking lot, I'd stopped breathing about 30 seconds before. My airway had swollen completely shut, and my lips had turned from red to blue to a grayish color that made several students turn away or start crying. Mrs. Kovacs was trying to perform CPR, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely maintain the rhythm. The school nurse had arrived with her medical bag and was frantically searching for something while shouting at Mrs. Kovacs to keep going. Someone was screaming for an ambulance. Multiple people, actually, their voices blending together into a chorus of panic. The crowd had swollen to maybe 200 students now, all watching with their phones out, and some of them would later post the videos on social media despite explicit instructions not to. My face was gray and puffy and didn't look human anymore, and my body was completely limp against the asphalt. Autumn broke through the crowd and dropped to her knees next to me, her hands fumbling with the EpiPen case. The school nurse saw what she had and grabbed it from her, popping the case open and pulling out the auto-injector with practiced efficiency that came from years of training. She jerked up the leg of my jeans and pressed the orange tip against my outer thigh hard enough to leave a mark, and the spring-loaded needle punched through fabric and skin with a click that seemed impossibly loud. She held it there for a count of 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours, and everyone in the circle watched my face for any sign of improvement. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Mrs. Kovacs' CPR compressions faltered as she stared at my unchanged expression. Then my chest jerked once, twice, and I sucked in a rasping breath that sounded like gravel being dragged across metal. The crowd erupted in relieved sounds that were part cheer and part sob, but the school nurse wasn't celebrating yet. She had her fingers pressed to my neck, checking my pulse, and was barking orders at Mrs. Kovacs to keep me on my side in recovery position. My breathing was still labored and my face was still swollen, but air was moving through my damaged throat again, which meant I might actually survive this. The nurse was on her radio calling for the ambulance status, and dispatch was telling her 8 minutes out because the fire trucks blocking all the streets around the school were making it impossible for the ambulance to get through. 8 minutes might as well be 8 hours when someone's airway is compromised, and the nurse was already pulling out a secondary EpiPen from her medical bag just in case my symptoms rebounded before the paramedics arrived. She kept talking to me in a calm, steady voice, asking me to squeeze her hand if I could hear her, but I couldn't make my fingers work yet. Inside the school building, Principal Winters was standing in the main office staring at the security monitors showing the scene in the parking lot. He'd been watching since the moment Mrs. Kovacs had radioed about a student in medical distress, and he'd seen everything unfold with growing horror. The fire alarm control panel on the wall next to him showed the trigger point for the alarm had been a manual pull station in the East Wing boys' bathroom, which meant this wasn't a real fire but a false alarm that someone had deliberately set off. He'd gotten confirmation of that about 90 seconds after the alarm started, which meant he could have given the all-clear immediately and let students return to the building where medical supplies were accessible. But the district policy was crystal clear about completing full evacuation and sweep protocols, even for confirmed false alarms, because liability attorneys had written the rules after a previous lawsuit in a neighboring district. He'd made a choice to follow policy over common sense, and now a student was lying on the parking lot asphalt fighting for her life, because rules were rules, and he couldn't be seen playing favorites or bending regulations. His hand hovered over the intercom button that would broadcast an all-clear to the assembled students outside, but his vice principal Judith Carver stepped in front of him and shook her head. "The fire marshal hasn't arrived yet to give official clearance," she said, "and if we let students back in before that happens and something goes wrong, the district will crucify us." Principal Winters looked back at the monitor showing the nurse working on me, then at his vice principal's face, and he could see his own fear reflected there. They were more scared of the lawsuits and the district administration than they were about the actual student dying in their parking lot, and both of them knew it, but neither would say it out loud. The ambulance finally arrived 7 minutes after the EpiPen injection, weaving carefully through the fire trucks that were still blocking the street even though there was no fire. 2 paramedics jumped out with equipment bags and portable monitors, and they took over from the school nurse with smooth efficiency that came from responding to allergic reactions multiple times per week in a county with 3 million people. They got an IV started in my arm and pushed a syringe of something that made my breathing ease slightly, though my throat still felt like it was lined with broken glass. One paramedic was asking me questions about what I'd eaten, and when symptoms started, while the other one was listening to my lungs with a stethoscope and frowning at whatever he heard. They loaded me onto a stretcher and into the ambulance while Autumn followed alongside, refusing to let go of my hand even when the paramedics said only family was allowed to ride along. Mrs. Kovacs stood in the parking lot watching the ambulance pull away with lights flashing, and her hands were still shaking from the CPR compressions she'd performed. Around her, students were starting to break formation and cluster in groups talking about what they'd just witnessed, and several teachers were trying to restore order without much success. The fire marshal's car pulled up, and he spent 20 minutes walking through the building with Principal Winters before giving the all-clear that would let students return inside. By that point, lunch period was over, and the afternoon schedule was completely disrupted. But none of that mattered because everyone was still thinking about the girl who'd almost died because someone pulled a fire alarm as a prank. Security footage from the East Wing bathroom showed Caleb Winters, the principal's own son, pulling the alarm and then walking away with a smirk on his face like it was the funniest thing he'd ever done. At the hospital, doctors kept me in the emergency department for 6 hours running tests and monitoring my breathing while my parents sat in uncomfortable chairs beside my bed, looking simultaneously relieved and furious. My mom kept stroking my hair and asking if I needed anything while my dad was on his phone researching allergic reaction protocols and school liability laws with the single-minded intensity of someone planning a lawsuit. The ER doctor explained that I'd been clinically dead for approximately 3 minutes before the EpiPen reversed the anaphylaxis, and they were concerned about potential hypoxic brain injury from oxygen deprivation. They wanted to keep me overnight for observation and would schedule an MRI for the next morning to check for any damage, though they were cautiously optimistic since I was alert and responsive now. My throat still felt wrong, swollen and painful when I swallowed, and my voice came out raspy like I'd been screaming for hours even though I'd barely been able to make sound during the actual emergency. Autumn had been allowed to stay with me after my parents arrived and gave permission, and she sat in the corner of the exam room looking traumatized by everything she'd witnessed. She kept apologizing for not getting to my locker faster, for not fighting harder against Whitmore, for any delay that might have made my condition worse. I tried to tell her she'd saved my life and I'd probably be dead without her willingness to violate every school rule, but she just shook her head and said she should have grabbed the EpiPen sooner. My mom thanked her probably 15 times in the first hour, crying every time she looked at Autumn and imagined the alternative timeline where my best friend hadn't been brave enough to run back into the building. My dad was already talking about pressing charges against the school for negligence and against whoever had pulled the fire alarm for reckless endangerment, his lawyer voice coming out even though he normally practiced corporate contract law. The hospital social worker came by around 8 p.m. to take my statement about what happened, and she recorded everything on a tablet while asking careful questions about the timeline and the school's response. She wanted to know if Mrs. Kovacs had been told explicitly about my allergy and need for the EpiPen, and I confirmed that Autumn had explained the situation clearly multiple times. The social worker's face remained neutral and professional, but I could see something shift in her expression when I described how Mrs. Kovacs had physically guided me away from my locker toward the exit, despite knowing I was in anaphylaxis. She asked about school policies regarding medication storage and whether I'd ever been prevented from accessing my EpiPen before, and I explained the rule about keeping all medications in lockers or the nurse's office rather than carrying them personally. She wrote everything down and said a copy of this report would go to the school district and the state education department as part of a required investigation into the incident. That night, lying in the hospital bed with monitors beeping and IV fluids dripping into my arm, I couldn't stop thinking about those minutes in the parking lot when I couldn't breathe. The feeling of my throat closing and my vision darkening while surrounded by 400 people who couldn't help me would probably haunt my dreams for years. I kept touching my throat and my lips, which were still swollen but slowly returning to normal size, and the physical sensation grounded me in the present moment where I was alive and breathing. My mom had fallen asleep in the chair beside my bed with her head tilted at an awkward angle that would give her a stiff neck, but I didn't wake her because she needed the rest after spending hours oscillating between terror and relief. My phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from classmates asking if I was okay, and when I finally checked it around midnight, I saw that Autumn had already been suspended pending investigation into her assault of Security Officer Whitmore and violation of evacuation protocols. The next morning, the MRI results came back clear with no signs of brain damage from the oxygen deprivation, which the neurologist said was incredibly lucky, given how long I'd been without adequate airflow. He explained that younger brains were more resilient to hypoxic injury than older ones, and 3 minutes was right at the edge of the window where permanent damage usually occurred. They discharged me around noon with prescriptions for steroids and antihistamines and strict instructions to follow up with my allergist within 48 hours, and my parents drove me home in complete silence because no one knew what to say about how close I'd come to dying. Our house felt different when we pulled into the driveway, like returning to a place I'd left years ago instead of just yesterday. And I noticed details I'd never paid attention to before, like how the oak tree in the front yard had branches that could break in a strong storm, or how the mailbox post was starting to rot at the base. My phone started blowing up the moment we got home with messages from students at school who'd witnessed the whole thing, and several of them sent me the videos they'd recorded of me lying unconscious in the parking lot with my face gray and swollen. Watching myself almost die from an outside perspective was surreal and horrifying, and I could see the exact moment when the EpiPen took effect, and my chest started moving again. The videos had already been shared hundreds of times despite the school's demand that students delete them, and several local news stations had picked up the story about a student nearly dying during a fire drill. The comment sections were splitting into camps, with some people saying I should have followed evacuation procedures, and others arguing that medical emergencies should override fire safety protocols, and reading strangers debate whether my life was worth bending rules for made me feel sick in a completely different way than the allergic reaction had. That afternoon, a letter arrived by certified mail from the school district's legal department, informing my parents that I was suspended for 3 days for failure to comply with mandatory evacuation procedures during a fire emergency. The letter cited specific district policy codes and state fire safety regulations, and it emphasized that all students must follow emergency protocols, without exception, to ensure collective safety during crisis situations. My dad read the letter aloud in a voice that got progressively angrier with each paragraph, and when he finished, he threw it across the kitchen where it hit the refrigerator and slid to the floor. My mom picked it up and read it again more slowly, and I watched her face transform from confusion to fury as the implications sank in that the district was punishing me for nearly dying when their fire drill policy prevented me from accessing life-saving medication. She pulled out her phone and started calling every parent she knew from school board meetings and PTA events, and within an hour, She had 15 parents agreeing to attend the next board meeting to demand policy changes. Autumn's parents hired a lawyer the next day to fight her suspension, and the lawyer immediately requested copies of all security footage and radio communications from the incident. The footage showed Mrs. Kovacs being informed about my allergic reaction and need for an EpiPen approximately 45 seconds after the fire alarm started, which meant she knew I was in medical crisis when she forced me to evacuate toward the parking lot instead of toward my locker. It also showed Principal Winters standing in his office watching monitors and receiving confirmation that it was a false alarm within 2 minutes, then choosing to continue the full evacuation protocol instead of giving an all-clear that would have let students access the building. The lawyer filed formal complaints with the state education department and sent demand letters to the district requesting immediate policy revision and threatening litigation if Autumn's suspension wasn't rescinded and expunged from her record within 48 hours. The backlash hit the school fast and hard, starting with local news coverage that spread to regional stations and then national outlets picking up the story about a student dying for 3 minutes because school rules prevented access to emergency medication during a false fire alarm. The district's communications department issued a statement defending their evacuation policies and emphasizing that fire safety regulations existed to protect all students. But the statement only made things worse because it seemed to prioritize hypothetical fire danger over actual anaphylactic shock that had measurably killed a student. Parents started organizing protests outside the district office demanding that Principal Winters be fired and policies be changed immediately. And several teachers who'd witnessed the incident came forward anonymously to say they'd been uncomfortable with how it was handled but felt powerless to intervene against direct orders from administration. The story got picked up by national allergic reaction advocacy groups, who used it as an example of how schools were failing students with life-threatening medical conditions through inflexible policies that didn't account for emergency situations. Within a week, state legislators introduced a bill they were calling Right to Life-Saving Medication Access During Emergencies that would require schools to have override procedures allowing students to access critical medications even during evacuation or lockdown situations. The bill specifically named my case as inspiration for the legislation, and my parents were invited to testify before the State Education Committee about what happened and how policy could be improved. My mom prepared a detailed timeline with medical records and witness statements, and my dad worked with Autumn's lawyer to compile all the security footage and communications that showed where exactly the system had failed. The committee hearing was scheduled for the following month, and in the meantime, our school district was under intense scrutiny from both state education department investigators and media outlets looking for any additional angles to the story. At school, when I finally returned after the suspension ended, students treated me like I was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. They stepped aside in the hallways to give me space and spoke to me in careful voices like I was recovering from trauma rather than just an allergic reaction, though I suppose nearly dying probably did count as traumatic. Mrs. Kovacs was on paid administrative leave pending investigation, and a substitute teacher had taken over her classes, and the few times I saw her in the building before her leave started, she couldn't make eye contact with me. Security Officer Whitmore was still at school but had been reassigned to the parking lot entrance instead of hallway patrol, and he gave Autumn a wide berth whenever their paths crossed in the building. Principal Winters was still in his office but looked 10 years older than he had before the incident, with dark circles under his eyes and a permanent stress line between his eyebrows that hadn't been there before. The cafeteria became a minefield of anxiety because I couldn't stop thinking about cross-contamination and whether my food might contain hidden allergens that could trigger another reaction. I'd switched to bringing lunch from home in a sealed container that I prepared myself, and I sat at a corner table away from other students who might have food I was allergic to nearby. Autumn sat with me every day despite me telling her she didn't have to isolate herself from our other friends, and she'd brought her own safe lunches in solidarity, even though she didn't have any food allergies. The cafeteria staff had been instructed to be extra careful about allergen warnings after my incident, but I noticed they still weren't separating utensils between different food stations, which meant cross-contamination remained a real possibility that could put me right back in the hospital or worse. My therapist, who I started seeing at my parents' insistence 2 weeks after the incident, explained that what I was experiencing was post-traumatic stress, and that my hypervigilance about food safety was a normal trauma response to nearly dying from eating something contaminated with allergens. She taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques for when the panic would spike, but nothing really helped with the constant low-level anxiety that followed me through every school day. I'd been evaluated by a cardiologist because of the 3 minutes without oxygen, and while the test showed no permanent heart damage, she'd recommended I avoid intense physical activity for at least 6 weeks while my body recovered from the shock of the anaphylaxis. That meant no gym class and no after-school sports, which effectively isolated me even further from normal teenage life and made me feel like I was existing in some weird quarantine space separate from everyone else. The investigation results came out 6 weeks after the incident, and they were damning in ways that surprised no one who'd actually witnessed what happened. The state education department found that my school district had violated multiple regulations around accommodating students with life-threatening medical conditions, and that their fire evacuation policy created dangerous situations for students needing emergency access to medications or medical equipment. Principal Winters was found to have acted negligently by continuing the full evacuation protocol after confirming it was a false alarm, especially given that he'd been informed about my medical crisis within minutes of it starting. Mrs. Kovacs received a written reprimand that would stay in her permanent file and was required to complete 20 hours of training on medical emergency response before she could return to teaching duties. Security Officer Whitmore was suspended for 2 weeks without pay for using excessive force against Autumn when she was attempting to help during a medical emergency, and he was required to undergo retraining on appropriate use of force policies. The student who'd pulled the fire alarm as a prank turned out to be Caleb Winters, Principal Winters' 17-year-old son, which explained why the investigation had moved so slowly initially. Caleb was expelled from our school and charged with reckless endangerment and filing a false fire alarm, both misdemeanors that could result in juvenile detention depending on how the judge ruled. His father, Principal Winters, announced his resignation the same day Caleb's identity became public, though the district allowed him to characterize it as early retirement, rather than being forced out, which meant he'd keep his pension and benefits. The whole situation felt like a house of cards collapsing, with each revelation leading to another layer of administration trying to protect themselves from liability, rather than taking responsibility for the systems that had nearly killed me. My parents' lawsuit against the district was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount that covered all my medical bills and therapy costs, plus additional damages that my parents put into a trust fund for my college education. As part of the settlement, the district agreed to implement new medical emergency protocols that would allow students with documented medical conditions to access their medications immediately, even during evacuation or lockdown situations. They also agreed to train all staff on recognizing anaphylaxis symptoms and administering emergency epinephrine, and they would stock EpiPens in multiple locations throughout the building, rather than just in the nurse's office. Autumn's suspension was expunged from her record, and she received a formal letter of apology from the new interim principal, acknowledging that her actions had saved my life and should never have resulted in disciplinary action. The state legislation inspired by my case passed both houses and was signed into law 5 months after the incident, creating new requirements for how schools across the state must handle medical emergencies during safety drills. The law specifically mandated that medical needs must be prioritized over drill compliance, and that schools must have clear protocols for students to access life-saving medications immediately, without requiring permission or following normal evacuation routes. Advocacy groups called it a landmark victory for students with disabilities and medical conditions, and my family was invited to the signing ceremony, where the governor thanked us for turning a personal tragedy into systemic change that would protect thousands of other students. Standing there in the Capitol building with cameras flashing while the governor signed paperwork with my name attached to the bill felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life instead of living my own. A year later, I can walk past the cafeteria without my heart racing quite as badly, and I've stopped having nightmares about the parking lot every single night. I still carry my EpiPen everywhere now despite the old rule having been changed, and I've developed anxiety around fire alarms that probably won't go away for years based on what my therapist says about trauma responses. Autumn and I are still best friends, maybe even closer now because of what we went through together, and she jokes sometimes about her brief career as a vigilante medication runner, even though I know the whole incident traumatized her almost as much as it did me. Mrs. Kovacs transferred to a different school district after completing her required training, and I heard through the parent gossip network that she tells people she doesn't want to talk about what happened during her time at our school. The cafeteria staff still knows my face and goes out of their way to confirm that my food is safe. And I've gotten better at advocating for my needs rather than hoping adults will protect me when systems fail. The scar tissue in my throat makes swallowing uncomfortable sometimes, a permanent reminder of how close I came to not surviving that lunch period. And my allergist says I'll need to be even more careful going forward because my next reaction could be worse than the first one. My parents have become advocates for other families dealing with the school system, and my mom serves on a state committee reviewing policies around disability accommodation and emergency medical access in educational settings. The whole experience taught me that rules are made by people and can be changed by people, but sometimes it takes nearly dying before anyone pays attention to the ways those rules can fail the students they're supposed to protect. I graduated last spring and I'm starting college in a few weeks at a school 3 states away, and I've already met with their disability services office to make absolutely certain they understand my medical needs and have protocols in place that prioritize my life over their rules. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.